She was the golden heiress of Oceancrest, adored, admired, untouchable. But one night, her perfect husband pushed her overboard, leaving her to drown. The world mourned her. The city buried her. But weeks later, she walked back into a crowded ballroom, alive, with the proof that would destroy him forever. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the heiress who returned from the dead to take back everything. Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more stories like this. Now let's dive in. The grand ballroom of the Oceancrest Hotel sparkled that night. Crystal chandeliers rained light over polished marble floors, and a sea of gowns and tuxedos swirled beneath. Waiters moved quickly with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played soft music in the corner. At the center of it all stood Isabella Morgan. Tall, graceful, dressed in a flowing silver gown, she looked like she had stepped out of a dream. Her long dark hair shimmered under the lights, her soft smile hiding the weight she carried. It was Isabella's charity gala, an event she held every year in memory of her late parents. The Morgans had built Oceancrest City's largest shipping empire, and after their sudden passing, Isabella had inherited it all, the companies, the wealth, and the responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said as she walked up to the stage, her voice clear and confident, "tonight is not about me, nor about wealth for wealth's sake. It's about giving back. Oceancrest has been good to my family, and I believe it is my duty to give to those who need it most. With your help, we will open 3 new children's hospitals in the coming year. No child in this city should ever suffer because their parents cannot afford care." The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and the wealthy clapped politely. But behind the applause, there were whispers. "She always has to make herself look like a saint," one socialite muttered behind her champagne glass. "She doesn't know real struggle," said another. "Easy to give millions when you were born with billions." Isabella heard none of this. She stepped down from the stage, shaking hands, thanking donors, smiling for photos. Yet beneath her calm expression, she felt the same ache she always did at these events, a sense of being surrounded, yet utterly alone. As she posed with a group of children who had received scholarships from her foundation, she noticed one boy's eyes shining with excitement. That was what mattered, she told herself. Not the gossip, not the envy. Later that evening, her lawyer and oldest confidant, Edward Clark, approached her. He was a serious man in his 40s, with sharp glasses and an even sharper mind. "You've outdone yourself, Isabella," he said quietly, adjusting his tie. "The pledges tonight will cover almost half the hospital project already." "That's good news, Edward," she replied warmly. "It feels right, you know, to use what I've been given for something that matters." He nodded, but his eyes studied her with quiet concern. "And what about you? When was the last time you did something that mattered just for you?" She smiled faintly, brushing off the question. "Maybe someday. For now, this is enough." But even as she said it, she felt the hollowness in her chest. She had everything, wealth, influence, beauty, but not what her heart quietly longed for, love that wasn't tainted by greed or expectation. As the night carried on, Isabella stepped outside onto the balcony, taking a moment to breathe in the salty air from the nearby ocean. The stars twinkled above, and the city lights stretched endlessly. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill. "Mother, father," she whispered softly, "I hope I'm making you proud." She didn't know that in the shadows of the ballroom, someone was watching her. Someone who had no interest in her charities, her goodness, or her loneliness. His name was Jonathan Reed. He leaned against one of the ballroom's tall marble pillars, champagne glass in hand, his sharp blue eyes fixed on Isabella. He was handsome in a carefully polished way, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smooth voice that could charm anyone. But beneath his charming smile burned resentment. Jonathan had grown up in the slums of Oceancrest, in a world far from crystal chandeliers and marble halls. He had seen his mother cry at night, begging for rent money, while the Morgans' ships sailed past, carrying riches across the ocean. To him, people like Isabella were parasites, living on fortunes built by the sweat and blood of others. "Look at her," he muttered under his breath, his lips curving into a half-smile. The city's golden princess, giving away scraps and calling it kindness. But Jonathan was no fool. Hatred alone didn't get you far. He had learned long ago that masks were powerful. If he wanted to tear someone like Isabella down, he had to play the game. So he adjusted his tie, finished his champagne, and made his move. He found her still on the balcony, looking out at the ocean. For a moment, he simply stood beside her, silent. Then he said softly, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Isabella turned her head, startled. She hadn't noticed him approach. "I beg your pardon." "The ocean," Jonathan said, his voice smooth. "Always moving, always restless. Like it's carrying secrets from far away." He gave her a small smile. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. You looked like you needed a moment away from the crowd." Isabella studied him. Most men at these events introduce themselves with titles, companies, or who they knew. But this stranger spoke of the ocean. It intrigued her. "Yes," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's easier to breathe out here." Jonathan nodded. "I can imagine. Everyone in there probably sees you as the perfect heiress, the untouchable Isabella Morgan. But you're human too, aren't you?" His words caught her off guard. Very few dared speak to her like that. "And what makes you so sure of that?" she asked with a curious smile. "Because," Jonathan said, lowering his voice, "I've spent most of my life watching people pretend. And I can tell when someone's heart is carrying more than their face shows." For a moment, Isabella didn't know what to say. There was something different about him, something disarming. "And who might you be, to make such observations?" "Jonathan Reed," he said smoothly, offering his hand. "Just a man who admires what you do. Your foundation, scholarships, shelters, I think it's remarkable." She took his hand, shaking it lightly. "It's not remarkable, Mr. Reed. It's just the right thing to do." Jonathan smiled as though he understood her deeply. "And that's exactly why it is remarkable." They spoke for several more minutes, about the ocean, about the city, even about childhood memories. Jonathan carefully chose his words, weaving a portrait of himself as a man who cared about people, who admired Isabella's heart, not her fortune. When Edward came outside, clearing his throat, Isabella reluctantly excused herself. "It was nice meeting you, Jonathan," she said sincerely. "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his voice warm. "Perhaps we'll meet again." As she walked back inside, Isabella felt a spark she hadn't felt in years. Something about Jonathan's presence lingered in her thoughts. Jonathan watched her go, his smile fading into something colder, sharper. "Oh, we'll meet again," he muttered under his breath. "And when we do, I'll take everything you've got." Oceancrest City buzzed with rumors in the weeks after Isabella's gala. Newspapers printed her photo on their front pages again, but this time she wasn't standing alone at a podium or cutting a ribbon at a hospital opening. She was smiling beside a tall, handsome stranger with piercing blue eyes. "Who is Jonathan Reed?" the headlines asked. Some claimed he was a businessman with interests in real estate. Others whispered he was an adventurer, a man who had traveled the world before landing in Oceancrest. Nobody really knew. But what they did know was that Isabella Morgan, the untouchable heiress, was being seen with him everywhere, at gallery openings, quiet dinners, charity meetings. For Isabella, it was dizzying. Jonathan had a way of making her feel seen. He asked questions about her work, but more importantly, about her. One evening, they walked together along the Oceancrest pier, the air carrying the scent of salt and fried food from nearby vendors. "You give so much of yourself to the city," Jonathan said, his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets. "But what do you do when you want something just for yourself?" Isabella laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't think about it that way. My parents built something enormous, and I was born into it. The least I can do is use it for good." "But don't you ever get tired?" he pressed, his voice low and earnest. "Tired of everyone expecting you to save the world?" She hesitated. "Sometimes. But I don't know how to stop. If I walked away, I think I'd feel empty. Jonathan stopped, turning to face her. His gaze was intense, almost tender. You're not empty, Isabella. You're more alive than anyone I've ever met. That's why he trailed off, shaking his head as if embarrassed. Why you what? She asked, her voice soft. Why I can't stop thinking about you. Her heart skipped a beat. For years, people had courted her money, her name, her power. But Jonathan's words, simple, almost raw, felt different. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you'll let me stay by your side, Jonathan said. Say you'll let me remind you that you're human too. She smiled faintly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Then stay. From that night on, their romance bloomed quickly. Jonathan sent her handwritten notes filled with poetic words, delivered fresh flowers to her doorstep, and made her laugh with his wit. He listened when she spoke about her dreams of building orphanages, when she confessed her fear of being alone forever. And slowly, she began to let him into her world. Edward Clark, ever watchful, noticed. He approached Isabella one afternoon in her office, where she sat reviewing documents with Jonathan leaning casually against her desk. Isabella, Edward said carefully, may I have a word? She looked up, smiling. Of course. Jonathan, would you excuse us for a moment? Jonathan nodded politely, giving Edward a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course, Mr. Clark. I'll step out. Once he left, Edward leaned closer. You're spending a great deal of time with him. Yes, Isabella admitted, her cheeks coloring slightly. He makes me happy, Edward. Edward frowned. Do you know where he came from? His family, his work? I can't seem to find much about him. Does it matter? Isabella asked gently. He's not like the others. He doesn't care about my name or fortune. Edward sighed, choosing his words with care. Just promise me you'll be cautious. Too many people smile at you with one face and hide another. Isabella nodded, but in her heart, she wanted to believe Jonathan was different. That evening, Jonathan returned to his rented apartment, far from Oceancrest's shining towers. As he closed the door behind him, his charming mask slipped away. He tossed Isabella's bouquet of roses carelessly on the counter, his smile turning into a sneer. Not like the others, he mocked in a low voice. If only you knew, darling. He pulled out a folder from his drawer, a folder filled with articles, financial records, and notes about Isabella's empire. You'll give me everything, he muttered, eyes gleaming. And you'll thank me for it. The day of the wedding arrived like something out of a fairy tale. The ceremony was held at the grand Oceancrest Cathedral, its stained-glass windows casting colors across the marble floor. Outside, hundreds of reporters and onlookers crowded behind velvet ropes, their cameras flashing as limousines arrived. Inside, the air buzzed with whispers. Business tycoons, politicians, and socialites filled the pews, their jewels glittering beneath the chandeliers. Can you believe it? One woman whispered. Isabella Morgan, finally settling down. And with a man no one really knows, another replied. Mysterious, isn't it? The music swelled as Isabella appeared at the entrance, wearing a gown of ivory silk and lace, her veil trailing behind her. Gasps filled the cathedral. She looked radiant, almost otherworldly, her smile serene but nervous. Jonathan waited at the altar in a tailored black suit, his expression the perfect mix of awe and devotion. To the world, he looked like a man hopelessly in love. As Isabella walked down the aisle, she felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with hope. She glanced at Jonathan, and he gave her the warmest smile. She thought of her parents, of how proud they would have been. When she reached him, he took her hands in his. His grip was firm, almost possessive, but she didn't notice. The priest began the vows. Do you, Jonathan Reed, take Isabella Morgan to be your lawfully wedded wife? Jonathan looked into her eyes, his voice steady. I do. And do you, Isabella Morgan, take Jonathan Reed? I do, she whispered, before the priest had even finished, her eyes glistening. The rings were exchanged, the kiss sealed their bond, and the cathedral erupted in applause. Later, at the reception, the celebration continued in the glittering ballroom of the Morgan estate. Crystal chandeliers reflected off golden walls, an orchestra played, and the air was thick with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Isabella danced with Jonathan, her cheeks flushed with joy. "Can you believe it?" she murmured against his shoulder. "We're married." Jonathan smiled, kissing her temple. "Believe it, my love. From this day on, we're unstoppable." Around them, guests toasted and gossiped. Edward watched from the corner, his jaw tight. Something in Jonathan's eyes unsettled him, the way they flickered, sharp and calculating, whenever Isabella wasn't looking. At one point, Edward pulled Jonathan aside. "You understand what she means to this city, to her family's legacy. If you hurt her—" Jonathan cut him off smoothly, his smile never faltering. "Mr. Clark, you wound me. Isabella is my world. I would never dream of hurting her." But as Edward walked away, Jonathan's smile vanished. He lifted his glass of champagne and whispered to himself, "She is my world, and soon, so will her empire." That night, as Isabella drifted to sleep in his arms, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Jonathan, for loving me for me." Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his arm draped around her. His thoughts were cold, precise. "Of course, my darling," he whispered into the darkness. "For you, and for everything you own." The moon hung low over the horizon, casting silver ripples across the dark water. The yacht, the Seraphine, glided smoothly through the waves, its polished deck gleaming under the night sky. Isabella stood at the railing, the cool sea breeze tangling her dark hair. She closed her eyes, breathing in deeply. The sound of the ocean always calmed her. It reminded her of her parents' stories, of sailing as a family before fate tore them away. Behind her, Jonathan approached quietly, his footsteps soft against the teak wood. He carried 2 glasses of wine, his smile easy, charming as always. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he said, handing her a glass. Isabella turned, smiling. "It really is. I don't think I've seen the stars this clear in years." Jonathan clinked his glass against hers. "To us," he said. "To us," she echoed, sipping. For a few moments, they stood side by side in silence, the water whispering below. Isabella leaned against him, feeling content, even safe. But Jonathan's eyes were hard as he stared at the waves. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks. She had signed over partial control of the Morgan trust accounts to him. He had access to her shares. But her very existence still tethered him. Too many legal obstacles, too many protections. He needed her gone. "Jonathan." Isabella's voice broke his thoughts. "Do you ever wonder if this is all too good to be true?" He turned to her, masking his face with a soft smile. "What do you mean?" "I mean us," she said, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find out you were just a dream. That someone could love me for me, not the Morgan name, not the fortune." She laughed faintly. "Silly, isn't it?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. Silly indeed. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You'll never wake from this dream, Isabella." Before she could respond, his hands pressed firmly against her shoulders. "Jonathan." And then he shoved. Her scream tore through the night as her body plunged into the freezing sea. The shock stole her breath, the salt stung her eyes. She surfaced, gasping, reaching for the yacht. "Jonathan!" she cried, her voice raw, desperate. On deck, Jonathan stood watching, his face lit by the moonlight. His expression was calm, almost bored. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, walked to the helm, and powered the yacht forward. The roar of the engine drowned out her cries. The waves surged, pulling her further back, until the gleaming vessel was nothing more than a shrinking light in the distance. "Please!" Isabella sobbed, thrashing against the relentless tide. "Don't leave me." But the only answer was the sea swallowing her voice. Her strength faltered. The weight of her gown dragged her down. Panic clawed at her lungs as she went under once, twice. The water pressed in from all sides, merciless and cold. Her last thought before darkness threatened to take her was not of Jonathan, not of betrayal, but of her parents. "Mother! Father! I'm coming home." The night was quiet along the shoreline, save for the rhythmic slap of waves against the wooden hull of a small fishing boat. Ethan Cole worked alone, as he often did. Broad-shouldered and weathered by years at sea, he had the kind of strength that came from hard labor, not gyms. His hands were calloused, his clothes smelling faintly of salt and fish. He was hauling in his last net when he heard it. A faint sound, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. A voice. At first, he thought it was a gull. But then he heard it again, a broken cry. "Help!" Ethan's head snapped toward the open water. His sharp eyes scanned the dark waves, and there, faintly illuminated by the moon, he saw her. A figure, flailing weakly, going under. "God Almighty," he muttered, dropping the net. He yanked his boat around, powering the small engine forward. "Hold on," he shouted into the night. "Don't you give up on me." Isabella was barely conscious. Her limbs felt like lead, her lungs burned. She drifted in and out, the water dragging her down. In her haze, she thought she saw a light approaching, heard a voice cutting through the roar of the sea. Strong arms pulled her from the water, lifting her into the boat. She coughed violently, choking up seawater, her body shivering uncontrollably. "Easy now," Ethan said firmly, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. "You're safe. You're all right." She clung to him weakly, gasping. He left me." "Sure." Ethan held her steady. "Don't talk yet. Save your strength." He laid her gently on the bench, checking her breathing. Her lips were pale, her eyes fluttering. Whoever she wasn't just some random passenger. Her gown, though ruined, screamed wealth. But that didn't matter now. She was a human life, and she needed saving. Ethan turned the boat toward shore, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Stay with me," he said, glancing down at her. "Don't close your eyes. What's your name?" Isabella," she whispered faintly. "Isabella," he repeated, grounding her. "Good. I'm Ethan. You're going to be all right, you hear me? I've got you." She nodded weakly before slipping into unconsciousness. When Isabella woke, she was in a small, rustic cottage. The air smelled of wood smoke and sea salt. A blanket covered her, and the sound of waves lapped gently outside the window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memories crashed back. Jonathan's face, the shove, the cold water. Her breath caught. She sat up quickly, her body trembling. "You're awake." Ethan entered the room, carrying a steaming mug. His rugged features softened with relief. "You gave me a scare. Drink this, it'll warm you up." She took the mug, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. He studied her for a moment, then said carefully, "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Isabella's throat tightened. The words felt heavy, almost impossible to say. "My husband, he tried to kill me." Ethan's brows furrowed, but he didn't look shocked, just grim. "That explains the gown and the way you looked out there." He pulled up a chair, his tone gentle but steady. "You don't have to tell me everything now. But you should know, you're safe here. Nobody comes around unless they need fish, and I don't talk much to strangers." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. For the first time since that night, she felt a sliver of safety. "Why would you help me?" she asked softly. "You don't even know me." Ethan shrugged. "Because you were drowning. Doesn't matter who you are. No one deserves to be left in the sea like that." Isabella lowered her gaze, her heart twisting with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice breaking. Ethan gave a small nod. Rest. When you're stronger, we'll figure out what comes next. As he left the room, Isabella lay back against the pillow, her body weak but her mind racing. Jonathan thought she was dead. The world would think she was gone. And maybe, just maybe, that was her greatest weapon. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to gather strength. Somewhere deep inside, a fire had begun to burn. Jonathan Reed had taken everything from her, her trust, her love, her safety. But she would rise again. And when she did, he would pay. The city mourned. Within a week of Isabella's disappearance, Oceancrest was drowning in headlines. Tragedy at sea, heiress Isabella Morgan presumed dead. Jonathan Reed, grieving husband, vows to honor wife's legacy. Photographs of Jonathan in dark suits, his eyes carefully rimmed with red, filled the front pages. He was captured outside the cathedral during a memorial service, accepting condolences with the stoicism of a heartbroken man. "Thank you," he murmured to each mourner, his voice low, his expression perfectly controlled. "She was the love of my life." But behind closed doors, Jonathan's grief vanished like smoke. In the Morgan estate, he paced the marble halls, glass of whiskey in hand, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Finally," he whispered to himself. "Finally, it's all mine." Within days, he began liquidating assets, properties sold, paintings auctioned, staff dismissed. The Morgan fortune, carefully tended for generations, was being siphoned into Jonathan's accounts at a dizzying speed. Parties followed. Lavish dinners, new suits, luxury cars. Women clung to his arm at nightclubs while he raised glasses to his departed wife. The city's elite whispered, but few dared question. Grief made men act strangely, they said. Yet one man did not buy the act. Edward Clark sat alone in his office, staring at a document on his desk. He had known Jonathan's type from the start. The transfer of Isabella's shares had been suspicious, but her trust in Jonathan had tied Edward's hands. Now she was gone. Edward clenched his jaw. "Too convenient," he muttered. "Far too convenient." His phone buzzed. A message from a number he hadn't seen in weeks. "Edward. It's me. Isabella." For a moment, his heart nearly stopped. His hands trembled as he typed back. "This isn't funny. Isabella is alive," the reply came. "I can't explain everything yet. I'm safe, but I need your help. Meet me tomorrow, discreetly. No one can know." Edward leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Relief and shock crashed over him in waves. She was alive. But if Jonathan thought she was dead? Edward's eyes hardened. "Then we have an advantage." Meanwhile, in the small cottage by the shore, Isabella sipped tea as Ethan mended a net by the fire. The days since her rescue had blurred together, moments of silence, whispered gratitude, and the growing realization of the betrayal she had endured. "Your lawyer believes you?" Ethan asked, his voice steady as he tied another knot. "Yes," Isabella said quietly. "Edward has always been loyal. I trust him more than anyone. But we have to be careful. If Jonathan even suspects I'm alive." "He'll try again," Ethan finished for her. Their eyes met across the small room. Isabella's gaze was heavy with pain, but beneath it glimmered something fiercer. "I won't let him win," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "He took everything from me, my name, my fortune, my dignity. He thought he could throw me away like I was nothing." She clenched her fists. "But I'll come back stronger. I'll show him what it means to betray me." Ethan watched her, admiring the steel hardening in her voice. "Then we'll fight smart," he said. "Not like him. We'll hit him where it hurts most, with the truth." She nodded slowly. "The truth, and proof. Edward will help us gather it." Outside, the waves crashed against the shore, carrying away the last traces of the woman who had once been naive. Isabella Morgan was no longer just a philanthropist heiress. She was a survivor sharpening her blade. The gala was a spectacle, even by Oceancrest standards. Jonathan had spared no expense. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, golden drapes hung from the ceiling, and champagne flowed like water. At the entrance, a massive banner read, "The Isabella Morgan Foundation Gala, honoring her legacy." Guests whispered as they arrived, eyeing Jonathan with sympathy and admiration. "How noble of him, carrying on her work," one said. "Devoted husband," another agreed. "To lose her so young and still honor her memory like this." Jonathan basked in the praise, dressed in a flawless tuxedo, his smile measured, his grief performance perfected. He raised a glass as cameras flashed. "Tonight," he announced, "we celebrate Isabella, her vision, her compassion, her legacy. Though she was taken from us too soon, her spirit lives on in every project we continue in her name." Applause echoed. Jonathan's chest swelled. Everything was perfect. Everything was his. Until the doors opened. A hush fell over the room. The crowd turned, eyes widening, voices breaking into gasps and whispers. There she was. Isabella Morgan. Alive. She stood in the doorway, her figure radiant in a fitted black gown that shimmered under the lights. Her chin was lifted, her eyes blazing, her very presence commanding silence. Jonathan's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. His face drained of color. "Impossible," he breathed. Isabella walked forward, every step deliberate, echoing through the stunned hall. Camera flashes erupted. Reporters shouted. Guests parted like waves before her. When she reached the stage, she turned to face the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive my late arrival. I had some unfinished business to attend to." Gasps, murmurs, frantic whispers. Jonathan stumbled forward, his mask cracking. "Isabella, my God, you're alive. How?" "Spare me your performance," she cut him off coldly. Her eyes bored into him. "You all mourned me because this man told you I was dead. He told you I drowned in an accident." She raised her voice, letting it carry. "But it was no accident. My husband tried to kill me." The room erupted in chaos, shouts, disbelief, cameras flashing wildly. Jonathan's face twisted, panic flickering behind his charm. "She's confused," he insisted, his voice rising. "The trauma, she doesn't know what she's saying." Isabella turned, holding up a folder. "I know exactly what I'm saying. And I have proof." She opened the folder, pulling out documents. "These are financial records, showing how Jonathan drained Morgan assets after my death. Fraud, embezzlement, theft." Gasps rippled through the audience. "And this," she continued, pulling out another document, "is testimony from my lawyer, Edward Clark, who discovered Jonathan's deceit. And this man," she gestured to the side, where Ethan stepped forward in a simple suit, his rugged presence striking against the glittering crowd, "is Ethan Cole. He pulled me from the ocean the night Jonathan left me to die." All eyes turned to Jonathan. His mask was gone, his face pale and wild. "This is slander," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's lying. She's setting me up." But his words fell flat against the tidal wave of evidence, the flashing cameras, the witnesses standing against him. Security closed in as Isabella delivered the final blow. "You thought I was weak," she said, her voice low but carrying. "You thought you could steal my name, my empire, my life. But you underestimated me. I am Isabella Morgan. And I take back everything you tried to destroy." Jonathan lunged, fury exploding in his eyes, but security seized him, dragging him back as the crowd shouted and reporters swarmed. Isabella stood tall, unshaken, as the cameras captured the moment. The heiress returned from the dead, exposing her betrayer in front of the world. It was a story that would spread like wildfire before the night was over. The night Jonathan Reed's empire of lies came crashing down. And the night Isabella Morgan proved she was no victim, but a force to be reckoned with. The courthouse was packed. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashed, and crowds lined the steps outside, waiting for any glimpse of the infamous case that had captured Oceancrest. State versus Jonathan Reed. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The jury sat stiffly, pens ready, eyes fixed on the man at the defense table. Jonathan Reed, once the charming husband of Oceancrest's golden heiress, now looked hollow and frayed. His once perfect suits hung looser, his face unshaven, his hands restless. Still, his eyes burned with defiance. Beside him, his defense attorney whispered urgently, but Jonathan ignored him, staring across the room where Isabella sat with Edward and Ethan. She was calm, composed, dressed in a sharp navy suit. Her hair was pulled back, her gaze steady. To the public, she had become something more than a survivor. She was a symbol. The woman who had come back from the dead to unmask betrayal. When the judge entered, the room rose. Proceedings began. The prosecution laid out the charges: embezzlement, fraud, attempted murder. They presented financial records, showing the rapid draining of Morgan accounts. Witnesses testified: bankers, accountants, former employees, each piece weaving a damning web. Then came Isabella. She stepped onto the witness stand, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Taking the oath, she sat, her hands folded, her posture unyielding. The prosecutor approached. Mrs. Morgan Reed, or perhaps I should say Miss Morgan. A ripple of laughter passed through the courtroom. Isabella's lips curved faintly. Miss Morgan is fine. Miss Morgan, please tell the court what happened on the night of June 17th. Her throat tightened, but she met the jury's gaze. Jonathan and I were sailing on our yacht. The night was quiet, beautiful. We spoke of the stars, and then, without warning, he shoved me into the water. I begged him, screamed for help. He looked at me once, and then he drove away, leaving me to drown. The courtroom went silent, every ear straining to hear. Isabella continued, her voice steady though her eyes glistened. If not for Ethan Cole, a fisherman who pulled me from the ocean, I would not be standing here today. She turned slightly, nodding toward Ethan, who sat quietly in the gallery. The prosecutor stepped closer. Why would your husband want you dead? Because I trusted him, Isabella said, her voice sharpening. I gave him access to my accounts, my shares. But it wasn't enough. He wanted it all. And the only way to get it was to get rid of me. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor held up a folder. Your Honor, we submit into evidence the defendant's communications with offshore banks, as well as testimony from his associates confirming his intent to liquidate Mrs. Morgan's assets after her presumed death. The defense attorney leapt up. Objection. Speculation. Hearsay. Sustained in part, the judge said. Proceed carefully, Counselor. The prosecutor nodded. No further questions at this time. The defense took the floor. Jonathan's attorney approached, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Miss Morgan, isn't it true you were under great emotional stress? That perhaps your memory of events has been colored by trauma? Isabella's gaze was ice. Do you think trauma makes it easier to forget the face of the man who tried to kill you? The courtroom stirred. The attorney faltered. Jonathan stood suddenly, his chair scraping back. She's lying, he roared, his voice echoing. She was always weak, always naive. She. Mr. Reed, sit down, the judge thundered, gavel pounding. But Jonathan's fury was uncontrollable. He pointed at Isabella, his face twisted with rage. You ruined me. You think you're stronger than me? You're nothing without your money. Nothing. Gasps filled the room. Cameras snapped furiously. The jury watched, wide-eyed, as Jonathan's mask disintegrated in front of them. Finally, security forced him back into his seat. The courtroom buzzed, the damage irreversible. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood, his voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jonathan Reed, guilty on all counts. The gavel fell. The courtroom erupted. Jonathan screamed curses as he was dragged away, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You'll regret this, Isabella. You hear me? You'll regret it." But Isabella did not flinch. She sat tall, her face calm. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for the Morgan legacy. As she left the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward her. "Miss Morgan, how do you feel? What's next for you? Do you believe Jonathan will ever find redemption?" Isabella paused on the courthouse steps, the flashbulbs blinding, the crowd roaring. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying above the noise. "This trial was not just about me. It was about every person betrayed by those they trusted most. About every victim whose voice was silenced. I survived, but many do not. For them, I will keep fighting. That is my promise." The crowd erupted in cheers, her words spreading across the city within hours. Weeks later, Oceancrest was alive with whispers, not of scandal, but of renewal. The Morgan Foundation, once tarnished by Jonathan's shadow, was reborn under Isabella's direct leadership. She launched new initiatives: legal aid for fraud victims, shelters for women fleeing abuse, scholarships for children in need. But she didn't just sign checks anymore. She was present, meeting families, walking through hospitals, speaking to students. One afternoon, at the grand opening of a new legal aid center, she stood before a crowd. The building bore her family's name, but she didn't speak of wealth or legacy. "I was betrayed by the one I trusted most," she said simply. "But I was saved by the kindness of a stranger. What I learned is this: true strength does not come from money, or titles, or fame. It comes from resilience, from compassion, from never giving up on yourself. And that strength belongs to all of us." The crowd applauded, some with tears in their eyes. Later, in a quiet moment, Isabella found Ethan by the garden outside the center. He stood awkwardly in his plain shirt, clearly out of place among the suits and gowns, but his presence grounded her. "You don't have to keep thanking me," he said gruffly as she approached. "But I do," Isabella replied with a small smile. "You saved me. Not just my life, but my faith in people." Ethan shrugged, his gaze on the horizon. "You would have done the same." "Maybe," she said softly. "But you did it without knowing me. That's what makes it extraordinary." He gave a small smile, one she rarely saw. "And now? What will you do with your second chance?" Isabella looked out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting Oceancrest in golden light. "I'll live. Not just for me, but for everyone who needs someone to fight for them." Silence stretched comfortably between them, the waves whispering in the distance. A month later, Oceancrest hosted another gala, not for tragedy, but for triumph. Isabella stood once again beneath chandeliers and flashing cameras, but this time she wasn't alone in spirit. She had allies, friends, and a city that looked at her not just as an heiress, but as a survivor and leader. As she raised her glass, she said, "To second chances, and to the strength we find when we refuse to be broken." The hall erupted in cheers. Her story had become legend. The billionaire wife betrayed and left to die, who returned stronger than ever. A woman who turned pain into power, betrayal into legacy. And as the night carried on, Isabella Morgan smiled, not the smile of a naive heiress, but of a woman reborn. A woman who knew, at last, that true wealth lay not in what she had lost, but in what she had become. From golden heiress to betrayed survivor, Isabella Morgan's story proves one thing: you can take everything from someone, money, power, even their life, but you can't destroy their will to rise again. Her fall was the scandal of the century, but her comeback? That became legend. If you want more stories of betrayal, survival, and shocking twists, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.